Case 1. Pamela Hupp. December the 27th, 2011, and August the 16th, 2016. Lincoln County and St. Charles County, Missouri. In a quiet corner of eastern Missouri, a friendship that looked ordinary on the outside was hiding something no one around her could have imagined. Pamela Hupp presented herself as a devoted friend, a woman who showed up when it mattered, who sat beside people in their hardest moments. But behind that carefully built image was a plan that would take years and 2 lives to fully unravel. It began on the day after Christmas, when Betsy Faria, a wife and mother battling cancer, spent what should have been a peaceful holiday evening at home with people she trusted. By the next morning, Betsy did not survive the night. Her husband, Russ Faria, was the one who found her, and in the chaos and grief that followed, investigators turned their attention toward him almost immediately. He was arrested, tried, and convicted, sentenced to life behind bars for a tragedy he always maintained he had no part in. For years, Russ Faria sat in prison while the true architect of Betsy's death walked free, collected on a life insurance policy worth $150,000, and continued living as though nothing had happened. Pamela Hupp had been the last person confirmed to see Betsy alive. She had also, investigators would later reveal, been added to that insurance policy just weeks before Betsy's passing, a change Betsy's own family said she never knowingly authorized. Russ Faria's conviction did not hold. On appeal, his legal team exposed timeline inconsistencies and overlooked evidence that pointed away from him and squarely toward the woman who had positioned herself as Betsy's closest confidant. In 2015, Russ was granted a new trial, and this time, a judge acquitted him completely. He walked out of prison an innocent man, but the system that failed him had yet to hold anyone accountable for what had actually happened to his wife. Pamela Hupp seemed to sense the walls closing in. In August of 2016, nearly 5 years after Betsy's death, she did something that would ultimately become her undoing. She approached Louis Gumpenberger, a disabled man with a cognitive impairment, near a fast food restaurant, offering him work and cash in exchange for his help with an errand. What Gumpenberger did not know was that Hupp intended to use him as a pawn in an elaborate scheme, a plan to convince investigators that Betsy's real attacker had resurfaced to come after her. That plan cost Louis Gumpenberger his life. Hupp shot him inside her own garage and staged the scene to look like a home invasion, allegedly calling 911 and describing a masked man who had attacked both her and her supposed rescuer. But the story collapsed almost as quickly as she told it. Detectives noticed critical holes. A man with Gumpenberger's condition would not have plausibly been recruited the way she claimed, and forensic evidence at the scene contradicted her account at nearly every turn. Hupp was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in Gumpenberger's death. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, she entered what is known as an Alford plea, a legal mechanism that allowed her to maintain she was not admitting guilt while acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict her. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But justice for Betsy Faria was not finished. In 2021, nearly a decade after Betsy's passing, prosecutors formally charged Pamela Hupp with first-degree murder in connection with the original crime that started it all. The case remains one of the most closely watched in Missouri legal history, a story that exposed how an innocent man can be swept into a wrongful conviction while the person responsible hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of a grieving friend. Russ Faria's exoneration stands as a sobering reminder of how fragile the justice system can be and how critical thorough, unbiased investigation is in protecting the innocent. Organizations like the Innocence Project continue working to identify and correct wrongful convictions across the country, and cases like this one underscore exactly why that work matters. If this case moved you, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you never miss the next case. Case 2. Rebecca Ruud. On or around July the 18th, 2017. Ozark County, Missouri. Deep in the rural stretches of the Missouri Ozarks, a 16-year-old girl named Savannah Leckie had recently moved across the country, leaving Minnesota behind to start a new life with the woman who had given birth to her, her biological mother, Rebecca Ruud. Savannah lived with autism, and by all accounts, she was hopeful about this fresh start, about finally building a relationship with her mother on a secluded farm far from everything she had known. That hope would not survive the summer. In July of 2017, Rebecca Ruud reported Savannah missing, telling authorities that a brush fire had broken out on the property and that her daughter had vanished sometime around it. For weeks, the case was treated as a search for a missing teenager, with investigators and community volunteers combing the rural landscape for any sign of the girl. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, was far more devastating than a runaway story or a wandering-off scenario. Searchers discovered fragmented, charred remains inside a secluded burn pile located on Ruud's own property. Investigators say the condition of what was found suggested Savannah had not survived, and that whatever happened to her, her mother's farm held the answers. The discovery shattered the community and raised immediate, painful questions. How does a teenager who had just started rebuilding her life with her mother end up like this, on that same mother's land? The investigation that followed was long, complicated, and fraught with gaps in available evidence, largely because so little was recoverable from the burn site. Prosecutors pursued a murder charge against Ruud, believing that she bore responsibility for what happened to her daughter, but proving intent and causation from what remained proved to be an extraordinarily difficult task for the state. In June of 2022, nearly 5 years after Savannah disappeared, the case went before a judge in a bench trial rather than a jury. In the end, Rebecca Ruud was acquitted of the murder charge itself. The evidence, while deeply troubling, did not meet the burden prosecutors needed to secure a conviction on that count. However, Ruud did not walk away without accountability. She was convicted on separate charges: disaster response fraud, tied to how she handled and reported the circumstances of the fire, and abandonment of a corpse, acknowledging that she left her daughter's remains in that pit rather than reporting what had truly happened. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison. For Savannah's family and advocates for children with disabilities, the verdict left behind more questions than answers. How a vulnerable teenager who had just relocated to be closer to family could meet such a tragic and lonely end, without anyone facing full accountability for her passing, remains one of the most painful unresolved threads in Missouri true crime history. If this case moved you, don't forget to like this video, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you never miss the next case. Case 3, Diane Staudte. April of 2012 through June of 2013. Springfield, Greene County, Missouri. Some of the most painful stories in true crime are not the ones involving strangers or sudden violence. They are the ones that unfold slowly, inside a home, at a kitchen table, among people who were supposed to protect each other. The story of Diane Staudte is one of those cases. A story that took place over the course of more than a year, hidden in plain sight, inside a modest Springfield household that neighbors would later describe as quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. Diane Staudte was a wife and mother of 3. On the surface, her household looked like countless others across the Ozarks: a husband who worked, children who were growing into adulthood, the everyday rhythm of family life. But behind closed doors, according to what prosecutors would later lay out in devastating detail, Diane had reached a breaking point that she chose to resolve in the most quietly devastating way imaginable. It began with her husband, Mark Staudte. In April of 2012, Mark began experiencing a rapid, mysterious decline in his health. What doctors initially treated as an unexplained illness turned out to be something far more sinister. Diane, investigators later revealed, had been secretly introducing antifreeze into her husband's drinks over an extended period, a slow and calculated method that caused catastrophic damage to his kidneys and internal organs. Mark's body simply could not withstand the assault being waged against it from the inside, and he did not survive. If the story had ended there, it would already stand as one of the most quietly disturbing cases in the state's history. But it did not end there. 5 months later, in September of 2012, Diane's 26-year-old son, Sean, began suffering the same catastrophic symptoms his father had experienced only months earlier. Rapid organ failure, confusion, a body shutting down in a way that mirrored his father's decline almost exactly. Sean did not survive either. For a family to lose a husband and a son within the same year to unexplained illness might have raised alarm bells for investigators immediately, but at the time, the deaths were not yet connected to any wrongdoing. It would take the near tragedy of a third family member for the truth to begin surfacing. In June of 2013, Diane's 24-year-old daughter, Sarah, was rushed to the hospital in a medical crisis that closely resembled what had taken her father and brother. Unlike Mark and Sean, Sarah survived, but the survival came at a devastating cost. The poisoning left her with permanent brain damage, robbing her of cognitive functions and independence that she will likely never fully regain. It was this near-fatal event, and the pattern investigators began piecing together across all three family members, that finally exposed what had been happening inside that Springfield home for more than a year. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling picture began to emerge, one that involved not just Diane, but her other daughter, Rachel, who authorities determined had assisted her mother in carrying out the poisonings. When confronted with the evidence, Diane did not deny what she had done. She told investigators that she had grown to hate her husband, and that she viewed her own children as financial burdens she wanted to be free from. It was a confession that left even seasoned detectives shaken, a mother citing financial strain and personal resentment as justification for ending the lives of the people she was supposed to love and protect most. The case moved through the Greene County court system in 2015. Diane Staudte pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of her husband and son, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her daughter Rachel, who had participated in the crimes, also pleaded guilty and received 2 consecutive life sentences, though with the possibility of parole down the road. For Sarah, the surviving daughter, the aftermath of this case is a life sentence of a different kind. One spent living with permanent injuries inflicted by her own mother, a daily reminder of a betrayal so profound it defies easy explanation. Her story is a sobering reminder that domestic abuse and family violence are not always loud or visible from the outside. Sometimes they are silent, slow, and hidden behind a family's front door for months or even years before anyone realizes what is happening. If you or someone you know is in a situation of domestic danger, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available around the clock to provide support and safety planning. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Elain K. Young and Katherine A. Mock. March the 23rd, 2006. Novinger, Adair County, Missouri. In the small farming community of Novinger, Missouri, everyone tends to know everyone. It is the kind of place where a person's reputation is built over decades, where community trust runs deep, and where a former school superintendent commands automatic respect. That respect is exactly what made the story of Elain K. Young so difficult for the people of Adair County to comprehend when the truth finally came to light. Elain K. Young had spent years in a position of public trust, overseeing local schools and shaping the education of children throughout her community. To the outside world, she appeared to be a pillar of small-town Missouri life. But behind that carefully maintained public image, Young was living a very different reality, one defined by a secret romantic relationship with a woman named Katherine Mock and a marriage to her husband, Melvin Bo Griesbauer, that she had apparently decided she wanted to end permanently rather than through the courts. Rather than pursuing a divorce, prosecutors say, Young set her sights on something far darker, eliminating her husband entirely and profiting from his death in the process. Griesbauer's life was insured for a substantial sum, reportedly exceeding $700,000, and that insurance payout became the financial motive at the center of what investigators would later describe as a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy. On March the 23rd, 2006, on the family's own farm property, Melvin Griesbauer was shot in the face with a .30-30 caliber rifle. The location of the attack, the same land where he had likely worked and lived his entire adult life, added a particularly painful layer to the tragedy for those who knew him. Investigators soon zeroed in on Young and Mock as prime suspects, piecing together a timeline that suggested the two women had planned the attack together as partners, both romantically and criminally. The investigation that followed was long and painstaking, spanning years before formal federal charges were brought against both women. Because the case involved conspiracy and a murder-for-hire framework tied to insurance fraud, it ultimately fell under federal jurisdiction, elevating the stakes and the scrutiny placed on every piece of evidence gathered. In March of 2012, 6 years after Griesbauer's death, a federal jury delivered its verdict. Both Elain K. Young and Katherine were found guilty on charges of conspiracy and murder for hire. Given the calculated, financially motivated nature of the crime and the federal murder-for-hire statute's severe penalty structure, both women received mandatory sentences of life in prison, with no possibility of an early release. For the Novinger community, the case became a lasting example of how even the most trusted figures in a small town, a former school leader, someone whose job it was to nurture and protect the next generation, can hide devastating secrets in plain sight. The case also highlighted the sobering reality of insurance-motivated violence, a category of crime that law enforcement officials say remains one of the more calculated and premeditated forms of domestic homicide, precisely because it typically involves extensive planning well in advance of the act itself. Melvin Griesbauer's family has continued, in the years since, to speak about the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships where one partner may feel emotionally or financially trapped, encouraging others to seek help and legal guidance rather than allowing situations to escalate to violence. Community and legal advocacy organizations continue to stress that safe, legal paths out of difficult marriages exist, and that no financial or emotional burden justifies the taking of a life. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5, Teresa Stone. March the 31st, 2010. Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. Faith communities are built on trust. Congregants open their lives, their struggles, and their families to the people who lead them from the pulpit, believing that trust will be honored and protected. In Independence, Missouri, that trust was shattered in a way that left an entire church community and an entire family trying to make sense of a betrayal from within their own walls. Teresa Stone was, by most outward appearances, an ordinary wife living a stable life in Jackson County. Her husband, Randy Stone, worked as an insurance agent, providing for their household and maintaining the kind of steady, respectable profession that neighbors and friends would have described as reliable and unremarkable. But within their marriage, something had shifted. Teresa had entered into a long-term affair, and the man she had grown close to was not a stranger from outside her community. It was David Love, the pastor of her own local church, a man entrusted with guiding his congregation's spiritual and moral lives. What began, according to investigators, as a secret relationship eventually evolved into something far darker, a conspiracy between the two to eliminate Randy Stone permanently. Rather than facing the difficult, painful, but survivable process of divorce, prosecutors say Teresa and Pastor Love instead began planning how to remove Randy from the picture entirely, with insurance payouts serving as an added financial incentive layered on top of their romantic motivations. On March the 31st, 2010, that plan was carried out. David Love traveled to Randy Stone's place of business, an insurance office where Randy spent his working hours serving clients throughout the community, and there, in a place that should have been safe, Randy was shot. He did not survive the encounter. The betrayal was staggering in its layers. A wife who had turned against her husband, a spiritual leader who had turned against a member of his own flock, and a plan that had been carried out not in a moment of passion, but through calculated planning over time. In the aftermath, investigators moved quickly to untangle the relationship between Teresa Stone and David Love, examining phone records, financial documents, and the insurance policies that stood to benefit Teresa following her husband's passing. The evidence painted a clear picture of premeditation, and both individuals eventually found themselves facing serious criminal charges in connection with Randy's death. David Love ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, accepting a sentence of life in prison for pulling the trigger that ended Randy Stone's life. Teresa Stone, while she had not fired the fatal shot herself, was found to have played a central supporting role in the conspiracy, encouraging the plan, benefiting from its financial outcome, and standing by as her husband's life was taken. In 2012, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 8 years in prison, a sentence that reflected her role as a co-conspirator rather than the individual who directly caused Randy's death. For the independence community, and for the congregation that had once trusted David Love with their spiritual guidance, the case left behind a painful reckoning about the nature of trust, faith, and the human capacity for betrayal even within institutions built on moral leadership. Randy Stone's family has spoken about the importance of remaining vigilant, of recognizing that danger can come from the most unexpected and trusted corners of a person's life, and of seeking help through proper legal channels when a marriage reaches its breaking point rather than allowing resentment to escalate into violence. Community support organizations continue to emphasize that safe exits from difficult marriages exist and that no relationship, however painful, justifies the ending of a life. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Gypsy Rose Blanchard. June the 10th, 2015. Springfield, Greene County, Missouri. Few cases in modern Missouri history have generated as much public fascination, sympathy, and moral complexity as the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a case that forced the public to confront difficult questions about abuse, survival, and where the line falls between victim and offender. For years, Gypsy Rose Blanchard's life was defined entirely by her mother, Dee Blanchard. To the outside world, Dee appeared to be an extraordinarily devoted single mother, caring tirelessly for a daughter who suffered from a long list of severe medical conditions: leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, and cognitive impairments that reportedly left Gypsy confined to a wheelchair for most of her young life. Their community rallied around them. Charities built the family a home. Strangers donated money, sent gifts, and celebrated Dee as a model of maternal sacrifice. None of it was true. What investigators would eventually uncover was one of the most extensively documented cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy in American history, a psychological condition in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care, often to gain sympathy, attention, and support from others. Gypsy Rose was not actually sick. She could walk. She did not have leukemia. Nearly every diagnosis her mother had presented to doctors, charities, and the public over the course of roughly 2 decades had been fabricated, exaggerated, or medically manufactured, subjecting Gypsy to countless unnecessary procedures, medications, and a wheelchair-bound existence that had no basis in genuine medical need. By the time Gypsy reached her early 20s, she had spent virtually her entire life isolated, controlled, and monitored by her mother, with little to no access to friends, unsupervised outings, or basic personal autonomy. It was through a secret online relationship with a man named Nicholas Gojon that Gypsy finally found what she believed was her only path to escape. Desperate to break free from her mother's control, Gypsy is reported to have convinced Gojon to travel to their Springfield home. On June the 10th, 2015, Dee Blanchard's life came to an end inside that home, at the hands of Gojon, with prosecutors alleging Gypsy had played a direct role in orchestrating the plan out of desperation to finally be free. The case that followed became a national conversation about abuse, complicity, and culpability. Nicholas Gojon was tried and found guilty of first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life in prison for his direct role in ending Dee's life. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's case, however, unfolded very differently in the eyes of the court and the public. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, and mental health experts extensively documented the profound, sustained abuse Gypsy had endured throughout her childhood and young adulthood, and that context shaped the resolution of her case. She ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 10-year prison sentence, a significantly reduced outcome compared to her co-defendant, reflecting the extraordinary abuse she had survived. Gypsy was released on parole in late 2023, and in the years since, she has become a prominent public voice speaking about the realities of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, medical child abuse, and the long road of healing that follows years of manufactured trauma. Her story has since been the subject of documentaries and television dramatizations, largely because it forces such a difficult and necessary conversation. That abuse does not always look the way society expects it to, and that victims of prolonged psychological and medical exploitation may respond to their trauma in ways that are complicated, painful, and difficult to categorize simply as right or wrong. Advocates for survivors of medical child abuse continue to point to Gypsy's case as a critical example of why pediatric medical professionals, teachers, and community members need to be trained to recognize the warning signs of fabricated or induced illness. If you suspect a child in your life may be experiencing this form of abuse, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline offers confidential support and guidance around the clock. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Brittany Wilson. December the 24th, 2021. Cape Girardeau, Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. Christmas Eve is supposed to be one of the most peaceful nights of the year, a night of quiet anticipation, of family gathering close, of warmth inside homes across the country as the rest of the world slows down. In Cape Girardeau, Missouri, that peaceful night was shattered in a way that would leave investigators, neighbors, and an entire community struggling to process what had unfolded behind one ordinary front door. Just before the household would have normally been settling into the holiday, emergency dispatchers received a call from a woman identifying herself as Brittany Wilson, then 32 years old. On the line, she made a confession that stopped responders in their tracks. She told them that her boyfriend, Harrison Stephen Foster, had not survived an encounter inside their shared home, and that she had been the one responsible. When officers arrived at the residence, what they found was almost impossible to process calmly. Wilson was standing outside in the front yard, covered in blood, holding a sword. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to hide what had occurred. She was simply standing there, waiting, in a scene that immediately signaled to responding officers that whatever had happened inside that home had been sudden, violent, and deeply disturbing. As investigators began piecing together the events of that night, Wilson reportedly told them she had been using methamphetamine prior to the incident, and that in the grip of that drug-induced state, she came to believe that Harrison's body had been overtaken by alternate entities, that the man she loved was no longer, in her mind, the person standing in front of her. It was this belief, according to what she conveyed to investigators, that led her to act in the way that she did. The case immediately raised complex questions that extended beyond a simple determination of guilt or innocence. Was this an act carried out with full understanding of its consequences? Or was it the product of a mind so profoundly altered by substance use that criminal culpability itself became a legitimate legal question? Missouri law, like most states, requires prosecutors to establish that a defendant possessed the mental capacity to understand the nature of their actions, and cases involving severe substance-induced psychosis often become deeply complicated legal battlegrounds. Brittany Wilson was arrested at the scene and formally charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. In the years since her arrest, her case has moved through the Missouri court system slowly and carefully, marked by extensive psychiatric evaluations aimed at determining whether she was competent to stand trial, and whether her mental state at the time of the incident could serve as a legal defense. As of this reporting, her legal proceedings remain ongoing, and under the law, she is presumed innocent unless and until a court determines otherwise. Harrison Stephen Foster's family has had to grieve not only the sudden loss of someone they loved, but the added trauma of watching a legal process unfold slowly, filled with uncertainty, competency hearings, and unanswered questions about what truly happened that night. Cases like this one underscore a growing and urgent public health conversation in Missouri and across the country. The devastating ripple effects of methamphetamine addiction on individuals, their partners, and entire families. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Lois Armour. October of 2025. Paris, Monroe County, Missouri. In the small town of Paris, Missouri, a manhunt for a wanted fugitive turned into a tragedy that pulled an elderly woman and her family into the center of a homicide investigation. A case that raises difficult questions about loyalty, protection, and the legal limits of standing by family when the law comes knocking. Charles Armour was, by the fall of 2025, a wanted man. Investigators in neighboring Rawls County believed he was connected to a homicide, and law enforcement officers had been actively searching for him across the region. Their search eventually led them to a residence in Paris, Monroe County, where 79-year-old Lois Armour and her relative, Patty Armour, were present. According to investigators, when officers arrived and began asking questions about Charles's whereabouts, the two women did not tell the truth. Instead of cooperating with the search, prosecutors alleged the women actively worked to conceal him, hiding him inside a master bathroom within the home and attempting to distract officers to buy him time or throw them off his trail. The situation escalated with devastating speed. When Charles was ultimately discovered inside the home, he did not surrender peacefully. Instead, he opened fire, wounding a sheriff's deputy in the exchange that followed. Law enforcement returned fire, and Charles Armour did not survive the encounter. Because a death occurred during the commission of a felony, specifically, the alleged act of harboring and hindering the apprehension of a wanted fugitive, Missouri law allows prosecutors to pursue what is known as felony murder charges against those found to have participated in the underlying felony, even if they did not personally cause the death themselves. Under this legal framework, Lois Armour was charged with felony second-degree murder, alongside a charge of hindering prosecution, based on the allegation that her decision to actively conceal Charles from law enforcement directly contributed to the chain of events that ended in a deputy being wounded and Charles losing his life. At 79 years old, Lois Armour's case has drawn significant attention, both because of her age and because it raises broader legal and ethical questions about how far family loyalty can extend before it crosses into criminal liability. Her 4-day trial has been scheduled to begin on March 2, 2027, and as with any pending case, she remains presumed innocent under the law until a jury has the opportunity to weigh the evidence and reach a verdict. For the deputy who was wounded during the encounter, and for law enforcement officers across Monroe and Rawls counties, the case serves as a sobering reminder of the very real dangers officers face during fugitive apprehension efforts, even in small, seemingly quiet rural communities. Law enforcement advocacy organizations continue to emphasize the importance of community cooperation during active investigations, noting that concealing a wanted individual, even a family member, can escalate a dangerous situation into a fatal one for everyone involved. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Christina Duckett. September 9th, 2018. Springfield, Greene County, Missouri. Online dating has become one of the most common ways people meet in modern America, a tool that has connected countless couples safely and successfully. But it has also introduced a layer of risk that did not exist in previous generations. The risk of meeting someone whose true intentions remain hidden until it is far too late. In Springfield, Missouri, that risk turned into tragedy for a man named Joshua Brooks, a resident of nearby Republic, who believed he was simply going on a first date. Joshua connected with a woman named Christina Duckett through an online dating application, the kind of casual, modern introduction that happens thousands of times a day across the country. The two arranged to meet for a movie, a low-pressure first date that likely felt, to Joshua, like the beginning of something promising, or at the very least, an enjoyable evening out. There was nothing about the plan that suggested anything other than an ordinary night. After the film ended, the two got into a vehicle together, and rather than heading toward a public, well-lit location to end the evening, they drove to a dark, secluded, dead-end street. What happened next remains one of the most chilling moments captured in this entire collection of cases. While sitting inside the vehicle, prosecutors say, Christina Duckett turned toward Joshua and fired 3 shots at close range. He did not survive. In the aftermath, she left the scene, abandoning his truck with him still inside it, leaving him in that isolated location. The investigation that followed moved relatively quickly, aided significantly by digital evidence. Records from the dating application that had connected the two of them, cell phone location data placing Duckett at the scene, and forensic evidence gathered from the vehicle itself. Detectives were able to build a timeline that left little room for alternative explanations, and Duckett was arrested and charged in connection with Joshua's passing. In November of 2019, a jury reviewed the evidence presented by prosecutors and found Christina Duckett guilty of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. 2 months later, in January of 2020, she was formally sentenced to 30 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both the calculated nature of the act and the vulnerability of a victim who had done nothing more than agree to a first date. For Joshua Brooks's family and friends, the case became a devastating symbol of a specific modern danger that so many people do not fully consider when arranging to meet someone from the internet for the first time. Personal safety advocates continue to stress practical precautions for anyone using dating applications. Always meeting in well-lit, public locations, informing a trusted friend or family member of your plans and location in real time, and trusting your instincts if something about a situation begins to feel unsafe. Organizations focused on dating safety education continue to work with app developers and law enforcement to help reduce the number of tragedies like this one. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10, Heather Smith. April the 13th, 2025. Holt's Summit, Callaway County, Missouri, with the trial held in Boone County. Not every case in this collection began with careful planning or long-term deception. Some tragedies unfold in a matter of seconds, born out of a disagreement that should never have escalated beyond raised voices. And the story of Heather Smith stands as a sobering final chapter in this look at Missouri cases, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary neighborhood dispute can turn irreversible. Heather Smith lived in an apartment complex in Holt's Summit, a small community in Callaway County. Like countless neighbors before her, she found herself in a disagreement involving her children and the children of a woman living nearby. What began as the kind of dispute that plays out in apartment complexes and neighborhoods across the country, parents disagreeing over how their kids were treating one another, took a dangerous turn when Smith decided to confront her neighbor directly about the situation. The neighbor's daughter, a young woman named Kara Dills, arrived at the scene of the confrontation, and according to accounts presented in court, she came armed. The disagreement escalated rapidly from there. At some point during the confrontation, Dills struck Smith in the face, and in the chaos of that moment, Smith's firearm discharged, though prosecutors say that initial shot was not aimed with intent, described in court as firing wildly amid the physical struggle. What happened next, however, is what transformed this case from a chaotic altercation into a criminal prosecution. As Kara Dills began to turn away from the confrontation, seemingly to leave the area, prosecutors say Heather Smith made a deliberate choice. Rather than allowing the situation to de-escalate, she took aim and fired, striking Dills in the stomach. Kara Dills did not survive her injuries. Smith's defense at trial centered on the argument that she had acted in self-defense, pointing to the fact that Dills had arrived armed and had physically struck her during the confrontation. It is a defense that Missouri courts take seriously, given the state's legal framework around the use of force in situations where a person reasonably believes they are in danger. But prosecutors argued that the critical moment in this case was not the initial chaotic struggle. It was the follow-up shot fired as Dills was turning to walk away, a moment that, in their argument, no longer reflected an active, ongoing threat that would justify the use of deadly force. In April of 2026, a jury in Boone County agreed with the prosecution's argument, rejecting Smith's self-defense claim and convicting her of second-degree murder, armed criminal action, and 3 separate counts of unlawful use of a weapon. The jury recommended a sentence of 41 years in prison, a recommendation that reflected the severity with which they viewed the decision to fire that final, fatal shot after the immediate danger had seemingly passed. Kara Dills's family has since spoken publicly about the devastating and preventable nature of her passing, a young woman's life cut short over a dispute between neighbors that spiraled completely out of control. The case has become a widely discussed example in Missouri legal circles of the critical legal distinction between an active, immediate threat and a threat that has already begun to withdraw, a distinction that can mean the difference between a legally justified act of self-defense and a criminal conviction. Community mediation and conflict resolution resources exist in counties across Missouri specifically to help neighbors resolve disputes before they escalate to violence, and advocates continue to encourage residents to utilize these services at the earliest signs of ongoing conflict. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. 10 cases. 10 different corners of Missouri. 10 stories that, on the surface, could not look more different from one another. A poisoning that unfolded over the better part of a year inside a Springfield home. A farmhouse fire that hid a secret for weeks in the Ozarks. A pastor and a congregant who turned a place of worship into the starting point of a conspiracy. A fugitive standoff in a small Monroe County town. A first date that ended on a dead-end street. And yet, when you step back and look at all 10 together, a pattern begins to surface that is far more important than any single detail of any single case. Trust. Every one of these stories, at its core, is about trust that was broken. Trust between a husband and a wife. Trust between a parent and a child. Trust between a pastor and the people who sat in his pews every Sunday. Trust between two people who had only just met, hoping for something good to come from a simple night out. Trust between neighbors who should have been able to disagree without a life being lost. That is what makes these cases so difficult to sit with, and it is exactly why we tell them here on Cold Case Hour. Not for shock value, but because understanding how trust unravels is often the first step toward recognizing the warning signs before it happens again. We also want to be clear about something that matters deeply to us as we bring you these stories. Behind every name mentioned in this documentary is a real family who is still living with the aftermath. Real parents who buried children. Real children who lost parents. Real communities in Springfield, Independence, Cape Girardeau, Novinger, Paris, Holtz Summit, and beyond, who watched their own neighborhoods become the backdrop for national headlines. We tell these stories with respect for those families, and we hope you carry that same respect with you into the comments section. If any part of what you heard today resonated with you personally, whether it touched on domestic violence, substance abuse, child welfare concerns, or the loss of someone you love, please know that help exists. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, and SAMHSA's National Helpline are all available free, confidential, and around the clock. Reaching out is never a small thing, and it can change the ending of someone's story. That brings us to the end of today's 10 Missouri cases here on Cold Case Hour. If this documentary kept you with us from beginning to end, that's exactly what we aim for every single time. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a like if you learned something today, and leave a comment letting us know which of these 10 cases affected you the most. We read every single one. Until next time, stay safe. Look out for each other, and we'll see you in the next case.